All right, we will pick up then at the reserve fund discussion.
Okay, so we had an issue with our packet, and so you have a report that should have gone out, but that's just some context and information that we wanted to share with you all tonight, or today. So the reserve fund, and why we want to talk about this, because of much of what Bryn has been going over, is that we have a small reserve fund currently, and we want to have a discussion with council about their desire, if at all, to increase that reserve fund to allow us to better weather kind of the ups and downs of some of these scenarios that we're looking at. So right now we have about $1.9 million in reserve, which when we're looking at other jurisdictions, you know, there's a variety of policy and levels in which jurisdictions are comfortable having money in reserve. And this is specifically for the general fund. So when we're talking about other funds, they often have a certain amount of months in reserve in their funds. We have a couple of weeks in reserve of operating funds. And so why this is coming up now, I'm sure we're all aware of kind of the economic volatility, changes at the federal level, pressure at the state level. I think, you know, often when we're thinking about reserve funds, we're thinking of a big emergency such as a wildfire, having money to operate until other funding comes in, emergency funding, et cetera. But it's also a way to be able to weather a worst case scenario without reducing services for a short amount of time to build up that reserve fund. And so in talking with some of the other city managers in the state, as well as with, you know, our finance department, you know, our recommendation is to have the goal of building up to a 3-month operating reserve in the general fund. You know, you have Jackson County, for example, which has a full year of operating. I'm not sure that's a good fit for us. Central Point has 3 months, maybe that's a better fit for us, a like jurisdiction. And so it is a balance of providing service with kind of having money in reserve to create that stability. And so we came about money in the reserve fund coming out of COVID because we had kind of a collection of money, thank you, that we were able to place in the reserve. And since then, we have left it alone, and it has grown to some extent, but we have not continued to contribute to that reserve. And so really it's a question of, do we want to actively contribute to that every biennium with the goal of building that reserve fund up?
And just for an orientation to the general magnitude of numbers, we would be looking 3 months on average would be how much?
8.6.
Okay. $8.5 million, $8.5 to $9 million would what we would be looking at rather than the 1.9 that we have. Okay.
And so, you know, and speaking with Bryn, you know, and watching the way we budget, you know, our goal has been to provide the most service that we possibly can within our means. This would be kind of a change to that, and that we are looking to set aside money, potentially each biennium, to build that fund, continue, of course, to accumulate interest, but to be proactive in putting money into that fund. And so developing a policy which would require a certain amount to be transferred to reserve. Now, what that means in reality is a reduction for money elsewhere, right? And so, you know, when we're looking at, and in your packet, you have kind of a list of what's required by law versus what our discretionary kind of service comes in. It's looking at those discretionary amounts and saying, instead of doing this, we are putting money towards reserve, right? And so this is a big policy question for council to think about. And I think really it's, you know, starting to have that discussion as we move into the next biennium budget cycle, because that's when we'd be looking to either execute on a policy or not, pending this body's decision on where we want to go with this.
So for today, what we're looking at is to just get the conversation started. We're not looking today to be directing staff. We know that we'll take up this question again next year as we're coming ahead of the budget season.
Yeah, so I think, you know, what we would need is kind of what what's the right, if we're gonna do this, what's the right amount, right? So staff is recommending 3 months, but that may not feel right to this body. And so, that length of time in reserve, that we're looking for operating will change that number. And so, we can only provide scenarios if we have kind of what the right number looks like. And then we can go back and be like, okay, if we want to build up this over the next 2 bienniums, 3 bienniums, here's what that would look like. So we can bring that back to council for consideration.
Councilor Kaplan? Go ahead, Councilor Kaplan.
So just a clarification, Sabrina, if you talk about the reserve fund, which is, as you say, $2 million, and you're talking about it as a reserve to the general fund to kind of weather some of those dips, those extraordinary circumstances that we might see coming forward. We also have a policy minimum of, as Bryn pointed out, 16.67 fund balance, which works out to an additional, currently $6.9 million. So it's actually a total of $9 million, $8.9 million of buffer. So it seems like we already have, in a sense, a 3-month reserve, although the reserve fund is actually much less available for that sort of thing. It's only available for certain kinds of expenditures and only under certain kinds of circumstances. So are you thinking about changing all of that, removing the minimum fund balance policy, putting it all in reserve instead, changing the triggers for utilizing that reserve fund, and also the kinds of things you can spend on? What's the full thought?
No, I wouldn't change the general fund policy. I would like the bucket of money that council can't really get to unless certain situations arise, to be quite honest. So I would maybe change that, if we find ourselves in a pandemic or a recession, right? Some triggers that would allow us to budget that money to cover loss of revenue to ensure we can continue to operate at a certain service level. But it's really to recognize the fact that if we have a catastrophic event, we can only operate for a few weeks.
As we went through our $7 million of fund balance.
Which we can't kind of easily, I guess all bets are off during an emergency, but, having a fund specific for that.
The general fund balance policy is very clear. It says you got to maintain this 16.67, which it works out to $7 million. We've been well above that for many years, and now we're seeing scenarios that could have us dipping into it relatively soon or relatively later at some point. But still, it's a matter of dipping into that. The policy then says, if we get below that level, we've got to we need to take steps to get back above it in 3 years, in no less than 3 years, I think it says, which means that we should be getting back to it within 4 years or something instead of 3 years. So it doesn't sound like it's all that urgent. Now, obviously, it's more urgent. None of us want to stay below our policy minimum. It's the reason why we set the policy minimum. But it seems like that we shouldn't just dismiss that buffer as easily available to council to just use for whatever we want. In fact, we've not dipped into it at all. So I guess I'm not sure I understand the logic fully for keeping both a relatively high minimum fund balance policy and a much larger reserve fund policy that it is just sitting there. And I'm perfectly happy to see the reserve fund grow. I think it's it's prudent to do so. But I'd like to understand, we also have a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that we're not just sitting on big high reserves like you say Jackson County is, and in order to earn interest or whatever they enjoy with it.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly am interested in having this conversation. I think 3 months is good, and I take the point, of course, that we have $7 million, in there, and that's great. But the way that I look at it is that do we want to be in a catastrophic situation where we have, let's say we go forward with this, we have 3 months. That's probably about how long it will take for, let's say, the federal government to do emergency funding and to get it to us, maybe, hopefully, if governments change. But I think what's important to understand too is that do we want to be in a position where something happens and we're making severe draconian cuts, or do we want to be proactive and start making cuts now? I think the reality is, regardless whether we go forward with this or not, we're going to have to start considering cuts if we're going to try and stabilize the situation and somewhat curb this separation that we're having between revenues and expenses, and not have to keep relying on drawing down the ending fund balance. So the way I look at it is I think it's prudent to do 3 months operating. I think that that's at least a minimum that we should consider, knowing that we still have some of the ending fund balance, but so that we can smooth out what these service cuts look like for the community, rather than being in a position where having to make serious draconian cuts that might be very difficult to build back. Whereas if we start being prudent now, making cuts, putting in different levers, whether it's revenue, whether it's efficiencies, changes with capital and policy, we're able to kind of bounce back better, I think, over a period of time, rather than trying to just hold off doing anything right now. That's my perspective.
Councilor Shan?
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I understand discussing the 16.67% and considering that relative to reserves. I'm hesitant to consider that too much. I do think that we took the steps, what is it, a year or two ago, to reduce that from 25% to 16.67. So I think we took, a portion of that and allocated that more properly for services. I just am very wary. I think that fund policy is there to ensure and incentivize best practices under normal operating circumstances. And when we are into something catastrophic, I understand having money in the bank and not being put to services, to use, but I'm very fearful of drawing it down to zero and then it's basically like using your emergency fund down to zero. Now you are operating an entire government with zero safety net. And you figure if we have something catastrophic like that, and now our normal sources of revenue, like maybe tourism or anything, is burned down, I mean, we are almost immediately in full default. So I'd like to look at what we can do with the reserve fund and consider the policy for general fund, but I don't want to go there quite yet.
Councilor Shreve?
Thanks. Yeah, I'd be interested in looking at that. And I mean, not to like quote Dave Ramsey, but 6 months is always a good runway. Who wouldn't want a reserve fund? I think the question that we need to really be careful addressing is like, how do we fill it up? Like, of course we'd like it. I mean, it's a matter of time until we have a Jeep procession or a Cascadia event or whatever it is. I mean, it's a black swan because we can't forecast it. And I think it's important that we have that. It's just, where does the money come from? And people are at an affordability ceiling in their life here. So I think it's going to be a tough conversation, but I'm interested in a reserve fund and putting more money in it in a responsible way.
Councilor Hanson?
I understand $2 million is not a lot relative to our overall budget. I like the idea of having more in our reserve fund. I'm concerned moving forward with this next biennium, where we're going to find the money with all the projects that we have and our resources at hand. I do see this as a total package, as a $7 million reserve, and I understand that our 15% or our 16.67 average for the general fund is our own policy. We don't have anything that we've identified in this meeting that the state's telling us, that necessarily we have to change. As good stewards of our community, yeah, I'd love to see a bigger reserve fund. But I also, in my business, I wasn't here on council during the pandemic, but we received federal funds relatively quickly. I was surprised. I mean, we were up against the rocks, and a couple months later, we had PPP money coming in. And I don't know what the experience was with the city, but we will have to pivot, and we will have to constrain, and we'll have to do something if an emergency occurs. We're not going to be spending as usual. So recognizing that we've done this before and we got out of it with these policies a little bit higher, it doesn't scare me to move into the biennium with what we have. But yeah, I'd like to see more. I just don't know how we're going to squeeze more out of our budget. So I'm curious. I'd like to open up.
Councilor James.
Thank you. I can look at both sides of the coin and understand it. However, I was here during the pandemic, and that was then, and this is now in this administration that we have. I don't know if they would respond so quickly. So I would like to take a deeper look at this also. My question number one is, how are we gonna pay for it? Where are we gonna get the money from? Something that was mentioned shortly was that we have so many expenditures. Or maybe we need to look at that when we look at where we're gonna get the money from. What can we take away? Something the city manager mentioned, things that we want and things that we need. So when we look at that, to be able to take a better look at that, because I don't wanna put any more burden on our community and the residents of Ashland. I wanna see how we can do it and do it cautiously. So I would like to see that.
I think, for me, I look, we have the same conversation in the nonprofit world of what is an appropriate amount of money. We also recognize that there isn't many situations where suddenly you don't have any money. That suddenly you cross across into a new day and there is no money. It is more likely that certain revenue sources would drop back. If we had a cataclysmic situation, we would still have the property taxes that the county had sent to us, right? It's not as though suddenly one day we have no money at all. But I think it is also true that our risk of catastrophic disaster is going up, while the federal government's support for communities that go through catastrophic disasters is decreasing. And so what does it mean for us to be able to be more self-sufficient in a disaster of that magnitude is a big question. And I'm looking forward to seeing where we come to with that. But on the other side, there is a question of if some amount of that money is instead invested in making us more resilient, what is the trade-off there? Versus pocket and holding it and preparing to spend it later. So there is a question for me in terms of what is the best way, and there's probably some sort of a split. I think having a bigger reserve than we have right now is good, but I also think that, in the circumstances where we do have a catastrophic issue, things open up. Our ability to tap into an ending fund balance of some amount opens up. And so it's a big question, but what I'm hearing from the council today is that there is interest in continued discussion ahead of the next budget committee or the next budget process around the policy around the reserve fund. Am I hearing that correctly, that there's more discussion, people would like to revisit this before we come in? Councilor Bloom and then Councilor Dale.
Yeah, thank you. I really think that we need to have this conversation sooner than the next budget committee meeting. I mean, I understand where everybody's coming from, but what I don't want to do is I don't want to be in this position again. I don't want a COVID to happen and we get a bunch of federal money and it looks great and we're like, okay, everything's solid, we're fine. And then 4 years later, here we are talking about how we're in a budget deficit again going forward and we need to make cuts to try and solve it. I would rather us do the hard thing right now and set ourselves up for the future so that we're not back here in 4 or 5 years having this conversation. So I would like us to sooner have a conversation not only about the reserve fund policy, what that looks like, but also coming up with some solutions so that long-term we're out of this situation, not, okay, we're good till 2031, whoever's on council then, they can deal with it. I'd like us to be the ones to solve this problem now.
I don't think anybody is saying to leave it to whoever's here in 2030 or 2031. The question is the timing. The council has made it pretty clear that they want to have this conversation. And the next point at which there would be a strategic move on this is ahead of the next budget process. In between that time, we're going to have a series of other conversations about some of the things that have already been mentioned today. So my question here is the timing. I'm suggesting that we have a conversation in probably the third quarter of 2026 about whether there is a desire to change this this policy and aim for something different so that staff can incorporate that into the next budget. If there is a desire to bump other things off of the conversation ahead of time and do it sooner when we haven't had the benefit of those other conversations, then that's really the question in front of the council. Does the third quarter work, or do you want to see it sooner? Councilor Dale.
So Mary, yeah, thank you. I, to the extent just thinking about it in real time, I believe I'm fine with that time frame. I would think that if we're going to discuss it in third quarter of 2026, I would think that we will have, staff will come with options for us, because really this is about risk assessment. This is really about what we're deciding, what is going to be our line in the sand, all things considered, for a reserve fund. And I don't know what I don't know. And so I think 2026 Q3 is probably a good time as that leads into budget discussions. But I want us to, as we know, it can creep up. I want to come in prepared for that, so the council is in the best position to be able to make that decision and move forward with intent, as opposed to starting the discussion in Q3. So I guess that would be my hope. So because at the end of the day, and then just to add on to what everybody else was saying, is once we've come up with that number and we have agreed upon with staff and outside recommendation of what that number is, then we commit to it and we do it, and we figure out how to have it, because that's just what we've decided as a council. So yeah, as long as we can come on and I think make a decision in 2026 Q3 of what that number would be.
So I would, if I could, I would
Sure.
like to do it sooner than that, because if we're going to proactively be putting money towards the reserve, we are going to need to be adjusting other things. And so we're gonna need a decision by council earlier, because we're gonna start budgeting in July of next year, essentially, is when we're gonna start internally looking at things. And so our time frame is longer than what council sees of the budget process for when we're doing projections and service levels and staffing models. And so if council desires to actively put money towards the reserve fund, we're going to need to start incorporating that into what we're thinking about.
So one of the things I think that is tricky in this is that we won't know the trade-offs at that point in the discussion. You can draw a line in the sand and then later on say, well, I didn't know it was going to mean that. And so how do we make sure that we have those other conversations in tandem to that? And my thinking was that we would be working on those other conversations and then kind of end cap it with a discussion and a decision about the reserve fund.
Well, I think it's really an understanding of what is discretionary that we do, because that is what will be impacted by doing this, right? So when we're thinking about childcare grants or affordable housing or sister cities or, certain elements that we're doing, it's going to be a trade-off between those things. And so if today we can get, yes, 3 months is what we'd like to explore, and we need to understand the trade-offs of what that looks like and a model of building it up over the next several bienniums to hit that level. We can bring in kind of what the trade-offs are going to be. But I know there's going to be a lot of, processing through that. And so I think we need to have the conversation earlier, because we're probably going to need to have it more than once to determine how we want to move forward with that.
I have a number of hands up. Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that's exactly what I was thinking and why I was wanting to speed up the timeline, because I think that, one of the things that we need to be having a discussion on is what kind of recommendations or direction are we going to give on cuts? What kind of suggestions do we have in terms of revenue drivers? What kind of suggestions do we have in policy changes? And all of that affects this. And so if we don't do any of that and we do this, but then we come into the back end and say, well, now we want to cut this, all of that informs this. So I like the idea of saying, hey, we want to shoot for 3 months and reserve policy. And then I would really like us to kind of go around and tease out some ideas in terms of revenue drivers, cuts to services, personnel changes, policy changes, and allow finance and management the opportunity to look at, here's all the tools that council wants us to look at, because then they can come back with a host of options and say, here's scenario 1, here's scenario 2, here's scenario 3, if you package these various things together, and this is what it gets us in terms of that structural deficit, in terms of that divergence, so that way we can make an informed decision of what that total impact looks like, rather than piecemealing it and then having to make 20 different adjustments because we're all adding different things in and out. That's my thinking behind it.
Later on this afternoon, we have that discussion about the potential revenue generation and cost-cutting elements. So if that timing is what we're looking at, then what we should do is go around and answer the question, are you interested in a 2 or 3 month reserve fund discussion? I think is the basic one, and we would be having that in the second quarter of next year when we'd be tying it up. So, Councilor Kaplan.
Yeah, I'm happy to have the conversation. As I said before, I think we need to, in order to have that conversation productively, we need to have some realism associated with it, which is like, well, what does it actually mean? Are we talking about, I just heard Sabrina talk about, within 2 or 3 bienniums, by the end of the 29-31 biennium, the requirement for 25% of the general fund, according to the best or the worst case scenario, would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $13 million. So what is it that's going to take each year? What's the expenditure? Because it's an expenditure to go from the all of our sources of revenue into a revenue fund that's going to be required year after year in order to get up to that level. So I'd like to see that we're supplied with that sort of projections in order to have the conversation, because otherwise the conversation is just it's nice to have, who wouldn't want to have a nest egg.
Councilor Duquesne? Okay. Councilor Hanson?
Yeah, yes, I would like to have that conversation, and I would like to get creative. I would like to look at different revenue options, just looking at our interest on pooled investments at over $800,000 a year. If we just took that money and invested it reinvested it in this fund, we would have our $4 million in 5 years. But then we'd be pulling $800,000 out of our revenue source. So it's intriguing. I would like to look at this as different options. Like, what does it look like if we're building this over 10 years? I mean, what's the hurry? The hurry is when's the big one going to come? I don't know. I'm just really concerned about robbing our revenue to sit on, because we're in the business of providing services, and if we're going to have to cut services in order to make this happen. So I'm not excited about that, and I also don't want to look at a new fee to cover a reserve. That would be ridiculous in my opinion. So really intrigued by this, and I'm not in any big hurry, because I know we have those combined 7 million and 2 million, and a bunch of smart people on staff and in this room. So I think, yes, it's great. Let's keep it going sooner rather than later.
Councilor Duquesne, did you have we're going around.
Oh, going around, yeah. Like I said earlier, I completely want to have a deeper discussion regarding this, because, we don't know if and when. I want to be proactive. I don't want to put any more cost on the ratepayer, and looking at where we can cut and what we can add or take away is important to have a discussion, so that when we are at that third quarter, we can decide and vote on it. But I think we start the conversation now. We're going to talk about some services later on in this, right, Bryn? Okay.
Councilor Schrock?
Yes.
Councilor Dale?
As soon as practical is fine with me, yes.
Okay, so let me see if I can recap this. So what council is interested in is to have to carry on this conversation on the timeline that you suggested, Sabrina, so we could be complete by the time that the staff is starting to develop the budget next year. that we would be looking at a range of options. I would say in the 2 and 3 month time cycle, but also looking at making sure that we have annual expense estimates for what it would take to build that fund over whatever time frames are suggested. So some diversity in time frame, diversity in 2 and 3 month goals, and some hard numbers in terms of what we would have to find in our budget to meet those. Does that sound correct? Okay. All right. Anything else on the reserve fund? Okay.
So moving on, this is just an overview of some changes we made during the last budget cycle in terms of expenditure reductions and some operational changes. So I know we've been talking a lot about service levels and expenditures. So we did eliminate several positions during the last budget. We reduced all general fund budgets. We reduced council budget for training. We've transitioned to digital elements throughout the city to reduce printing costs, and we've had a reduction in park services. Currently, we're implementing payroll and HR software and soon to be implementing utility billing software to help get more efficient in those 2 areas. We are working on cross-training, and we are reviewing every position prior to it being posted to ensure that we need that position in that way moving forward. We've transitioned to having an insured paid leave program, which reduces the cost of that state mandated program to the city. We have transitioned to cloud-based services, which has reduced the need for personnel and IT to some extent. And we are currently reviewing all of our service levels within the department, as well as looking at our overtime usage throughout the city. So those are some things that we have done or are currently doing as we look towards the future. So when we were talking earlier about what we've done, especially around union contracts and personnel expenses, some things to think about. Our utility rates have an impact on the general fund. So we do have electric, wastewater, and stormwater coming. So franchise fees as well as the electric user tax are tied to that. Continuing to look at our staffing and a balance of technology and manual processes. So historically, we've been very manual process heavy. We are transitioning to more technology usage throughout the city. We have assessed both in finance and parks the ratio of management to frontline staff and continue to do so as we kind of reorganize both of those departments. We did an evaluation of our fleet to see if there's any consolidation to be done there. This will become a factor when we're talking about building consolidation later on, as we look at the number of buildings that all of our staff are in. That impacts the size of our fleet. And then looking at our current contracts, we've removed some or reduced some and continue to negotiate to get the lowest possible deal when we have contractual services. Brent spoke earlier about the building department fund. And we'll speak later about building consolidation and investments, maybe, if we have time. And then, as I mentioned before, we are deep diving into our fire department, looking at the impact of our ambulance service area and our current fire staffing levels, as well as the single role program. And then Brent went through our projections, and then we just did our reserve fund discussion. And then in your packet, you have kind of essential versus non-essential in terms of what we're required to do legally.
Councilor Dale?
Thank you, Mayor. Can you go back one slide? So a couple questions I would have just high level is on the second to last bullet point about the long-term financial planning, and it says post-strategic planning process. And I'm curious to know the thoughts, would we not consider flipping those two? And I'm just curious because wouldn't our financial planning, the outcome of that lead us to what we can and can't do realistically from a strategic standpoint as opposed to the other way around, where we come up with a strategic plan and then we figure out whether we can pay for it or not. So thoughts on that, number one. And then number two, just relative to all of these bullet points, to the best of your ability to forecast, when would council expect kind of a readout on all of these things before budget season? Just, I know that they're all ongoing, and I know it's always going on, but would there be a time in the next year where we can just get a status update on how all these things are going?
Sure, so start with your first question.
Yeah.
So chicken or egg, right? So strategic planning is really an opportunity for the community to tell the city organization and council what their priorities are, right? So I think we set priorities every biennium for our budget process. And so I guess you could box that in, though I'm not sure you want to. So if the community comes back and says, wildfire and, parks are 2 top priorities, then we know when we have discretionary funds or we're looking at programming expansion, that's where that should be, or that's where the priority should be with our expenditures, right? If you wanted to say, we're not going to ever expand, or we're not looking to take that feedback, then I think that's a very different process.
Yeah, I certainly get that both are important, very much so. I do, and I understand the chicken and the egg thing. I think I just got to chew on that a little bit more, just because I worry that if we ask the community what's important, which is of course our responsibility to try to achieve that, I want to make sure that we're not setting expectations that we can't meet either, based on not knowing where we are financially.
Well, and I think it's important to think about the process is really like, what are your high level priorities for the community? Like, who do you want to be when you're kind of like 10 years from now, 15 years from now? What do we want to see, right? And so I think it's hard to say, what do you want to see and not spend any money? Because then it's, are you getting their priorities, or are you kind of stuck in the box that you're in? And so I think part of the feedback of the strategic planning is, are we providing services that we should not be providing? Or are we not providing services we should be? And maybe we're providing services at a level that's no longer desired. So I think that's part of the process as well. Because if you have city staff, you want to provide the best service possible. And we're looking for that, feedback in both, are we doing that from council, typically with the budget process, right? So this is an opportunity to ask the community that question. And in terms of updates for the rest, so, appropriate utility rates, those are up to council to set, right? And so you will have the update on that when you make that decision. So that's really where that's coming from. As we implement technology and manual processes, that's a discussion moving into the next biennium with directors on what those staffing levels look like. Fleet, we've gone as far as we can go without consolidating our buildings. And the rest, like contract negotiation, that's just what we should be doing on a regular basis. So there's really no update to any of those, other than the building department funds will come forward. And then obviously the building consolidation investment is a bigger discussion that has large ramifications. And then we will see more information about fire coming forward.
Perfect, thank you.
Councilor Duquesne?
Thank you. I have a quick question. In the packet under this topic, it says key changes made during biennium budget process. And it has a bullet, a list of things that were reduced, but it doesn't have any dollar amount next to it. And I was hoping that we could get a dollar amount next to these that were reduced, so that we could really see how it's impacted cost, reduction in park restroom hours, reduction in splash pad hours at Garfield Park. It's in the packet, and if we could have some dollar amount next to that so that it can, be comprehensive and make sense to what we're saving and what we're not saving, I'd appreciate that.
Councilor Bloom?
Yeah, thank you. Kind of going back to what Councilor Dale was asking about, because I originally raised my hand as well. I kind of look at it a different way, slightly, chip your egg. I mean, I think it's kind of a 3-step process. I mean, we need to look at a number of things, right? We need to look at what are our rates gonna be? What is the savings we have with right sizing staffing and the management of staff fleet valuation, the internal services fund, and policy changes around that. Recommendations that we might have to consider for revenue generation or potential cuts. And once we have all of that information and we know what our baseline is, we know what is required of us, right? Legally required of us to fund. We know about what we're looking at in terms of discretionary funding. Then we can go out and talk to the community and say, look, let's find out what your priorities are, where you want to spend money. The last thing I want to do is say, hey, community, what would you like? We want your feedback, and then come back and say, sorry, we can't actually do that. What was the point of asking in the first place? Like, we need to have some baseline, realistic expectation to take to the community before we ask for their input on something like a strategic plan. I don't go to a dealer and say, hey, I want a Mercedes-Benz. He says, well, how are you going to pay for it? I don't know. Well, what do your finances look like? I don't know, but I really want one. Well, he's not going to be able to help me out. Right? So if we're going to get the Mercedes, we need to be able to have some numbers to back up and give to the community to figure that out. So I really do think that they need to be flipped for that reason. We need to have this conversation about what are the cuts that we're going to make, that we need to make, regardless of reserve fund policy. That's going to happen. I mean, that's just realistic. What are the revenue options, and what is the path that we're going to decide to go on, so that we have that baseline, so we can go to the community with realistic expectations, so that when they're making decisions, they're not feeling fooled or let down or lied to when we can't actually fulfill those commitments that we want to make to them.
So when I think about strategic planning, at this scale, I think it's a strategic plan for the community. It's not just one for the city. And when you set goals as a community, there are other entities that can step forward with resources to help make those happen. I think we've seen where we are the strongest is when we are partnering with community organizations. And so I would be careful about saying this is how much money we have. Because this conversation today has led us to say we will have significantly less than we had before. If that's the case, and if we're making the cuts before the strategic plan happens, then there really is no reason to ask this community what it wants. One of the concerns I have is the timing of this, right? The way that it's shaping up is that it looks like we're going to have conversations about cuts and reserve fund policies before the strategic plan is complete. Is that correct?
So no, not necessarily. So our budget is balanced. So there's no need to make a cut right now, right? And so the strategic planning process will kick off in January. You will have all that information for next budget. So I think you could choose to give that direction if you want today. But you don't necessarily need to do that prior to having that information. And I would recommend having that information before you make those decisions. Or I would just not do the strategic planning process, because to Councilmember Bloom's point, if you're going to make cuts and then take the community's feedback and you've cut what the community says is their priority, that's kind of, to your point, what's the point, right?
But to the calendaring conversation we just had a little bit ago, I understood you saying that you needed guidance from this council by July of next year.
Yeah, and you should have the strategic plan hopefully around that same time.
So some of that's going to be happening concurrently then. We're going to be having these conversations while we're getting strategic planning. I mean, if we're talking about having a completed decision to staff by July, we will be having to work alongside the strategic plan process happening.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So, and I think really, ideally, Bryn can step in. I want decisions made no later than September. So knowing that we often revisit things multiple times, I want you to start early and often having these discussions. So when it comes to drop dead, we're running numbers, we have that.
That's
locked
your
in by
quarter
September.
cushion.
Yeah, so, in terms of like the reserve, for example, he said 2 or 3 months. Well, that's several $1 million difference, right? And so I think obviously we need to have more discussion, but we need to lock in, is it 2 or is it 3? And so that's why I am asking that we do this earlier, because I don't wanna have that discussion in September.
Okay. Councilor Duquesne.
Thank you. I just wanted an answer to my question. If I can get the cost in the package where it says key changes made during the biennium budget process.
Yes, we can get that.
Thank you.
Okay. Other thoughts on this particular topic? Councilor Hanson.
Myself and a lot of my constituents I've been talking to are very excited about strategic planning, and it's really one hand in the other hand when we're talking about budget and strategic planning. But I don't want them to be in silos or vacuums. So it sounds like this is actually going to be really healthy, a very robust discussion about both what we want and how we're going to pay for it. And I think that if we gave our strategic planning a little less time, so we can bake it as full as we can, prior to making budget decisions, that seems to make great sense to me. So, it seems that both conversations need to be happening at once. And I'm not going to come into a strategic plan conversation and just put my kibosh on all good ideas, because we can't pay for that, because we know, as you just said, that this community and many other communities find money. We want to have a goal, we want to aspire, and even if we flesh it out that this is something we want, but there's no way we can ever pay for it, I still want our constituents to have that discussion and be fully engaged and really hear what that vision for Ashland is. Given that we have these 2 new neighborhoods on the horizon, and we have all of this climate adaptation and economic change, and there's just so much going on. That's all I got. Thank you.
So, any other discussion? So it looks like what we will be doing is just kind of following on behind that previous direction to staff around the timing. We will be taking up these other conversations in tandem. So when we talked about what might a reserve fund look like, we also understand that at that point we need to talk about what are the changes that we would make in order to meet the requirements of that reserve fund. It sounds to me like these processes are going to be moving along side by side. We may be early in the 3rd quarter when we finalize, when we pull everything completely together, because if we're expecting that to be July, when we get that final, then that would give us a couple of meetings to put the final touches on whatever the council has been working to develop up to that point. Does that sound correct? Councilor Blumen.
Yeah, I just think the important thing that we need to consider over the next few months too, we need to come back with, is how we're gonna close this structural gap. I don't want us to forget that. We're talking about a strategic plan and, let's, in a few months, we gotta figure out what the reserve policy is gonna be, but we still have a gap that we need to figure out. Even in a best case scenario, by 2031, we're in a problem. And so we also need to, parallel to those conversations, we need to be prepared to have the hard conversations about what do we do to put us on a path so that beyond 2031, we are not facing a structural deficit, that we are fixing it now and trending in a better direction. I think that that's critical. I mean, that's the whole point we're here today.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that. My assumption was that would be part of that conversation, because we need to understand what the delta is that we have to cover with any sort of policy decisions that this council makes. And that delta includes both structural issues and potentially a new reserve or a higher reserve fund.
Yeah, and I think, you never know how a strategic planning process is gonna go, but if the community comes back and says they don't want certain things, that's an easy deficit reducer, right? And so I think that's where that information may be helpful. It doesn't mean that there's not tough choices to be made around services, because I'm pretty sure 21,000 people aren't gonna all agree on what their priority is, right? And so that's where council is gonna be essential in making that final call, which is, why we have this form of government. And so I don't want to make light of the decision you'll eventually have to make, but I think that will be good information from the community that can help support the decisions that you're going to be making around services and what we do and what our priorities are for funding things moving forward. But yes, things will be happening, like always, simultaneously moving forward. It would be great if we could just pause everything and do one thing, but that's not our reality. So we will work to move all of this forward.
All right, any last discussion on the financial stabilization or our next steps? Okay, thank you, Bryn.